Well, good morning, brothers and sisters. Good to see you this morning. It's a delight to be here today to be able to bring to you a second part of a three-part series on marriage, my topic material for camp, which I never got the opportunity to preach there, but at least get the opportunity to preach here. And there's an old adage amongst preachers that if you preach the first part of a sermon series and people come back for part two, you've probably done all right. Actually, either that or they're really curious to find out what part two might be. And I think there's probably some of you, at least I've heard from some of you, that you're looking for some loopholes. So hopefully we'll be able to find our way through that this morning. I would ask you to turn in your Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 7 this morning. And we're going to be going to this passage in a few minutes. I'll give you a few minutes to get there while I remind you that last week we began this series by talking about the definition of marriage. What is marriage? And I put before you the definition of marriage as a foundational institution established by God at the outset of human history. That this is his theological purpose as the foundation of civilization itself, the very essence of humanity being created, formed by God in his own image, was a theological act in forming the woman and bringing the woman to the man. This is not just some reality that exists within the human species, whatever that is, but rather this is a theological reality. God established the idea of a man and a woman together at the very core of human history. It is a creative act, as I pointed out last week, when a man and a woman come together. It is the formation, marriage is the formation of a new creature from what was two distinct, unique persons before. In marriage, a new single creature is formed, a creature in the very image of God himself, formed from the man and the woman. Marriage is also a creation ordinance, established as a command, as the foundation of human life. The ability for Adam to keep that fundamental command to take dominion over the earth, to be fruitful and multiply, was only possible through the theological reality of God establishing a mate, another half, if you will, of Adam, to complete him so that he could complete the creation ordinance established in and through and around him. That's why I say this is foundational to human history. The very creation mandate that God gave to the human race that he had created could only be accomplished by the formation of man and woman together. But it is also a covenant relationship. It is a relationship established by promise between a husband and a wife as a bond. And it is a bond that parallels God's own relationship with his chosen people. It flows out of the reality that God himself establishes in the very core of his nature as God the promises that he makes. He does not just make promises and set them loose. He involves himself in those promises. I am your God, you will be my people, he said to Israel. And that was putting himself into that relationship. And so marriage is a creative act in which God forms something new. This new creature goes out into the world to complete the creation mandate that God had established for humanity as a covenanted relationship between a husband and a wife, which mirrors the relationship of God himself with man. It is a theological reality established by God. It's not just something that human governments invented in order to somehow satisfy certain secular needs. This was something God did at the very beginning of human history to accomplish his purposes for humanity. With that definition in mind, then, we come first in the two parts that follow it, then, firstly, to a discussion of the extent of marriage. As we move into the third paragraph of the 25th chapter of the 1689 Confession. We're going to talk about the extent of marriage. We're going to frame this theological purpose, and we're going to talk about how it extends. And I want to take that beyond just extension into value. What is the value of marriage? And because it's sort of tied up with the idea of extension. If God created this thing and it extends itself out into the world, what's its value? And okay, I'll put it in very personal terms. What's its value to you? What's its value to me? Especially as those who belong to Christ. And then, Lord willing, next week we'll come together and we'll do the same thing but in reverse. We'll talk about the boundaries of marriage. So we'll talk about where the boundaries of marriage are drawn. We're forced into that, as the confessors were in the 17th century. We're forced into it even more today to discuss where the boundaries of this thing called marriage are. But before we can get to those boundaries, we really should talk about the extent of marriage and its value. Now, when I originally preached this series, I preached it in 4 sermons, and there were 2 distinct sermons between extent and value, so I've combined them together into one, hopefully coherent sermon on this particular subject. All right, so let's talk about the extent of marriage. Let me read to you the 3rd paragraph then of the confession, this chapter of the confession. It is lawful for all sorts of people to marry who are able with judgment to give their consent. Yet, it is the duty of Christians to marry in the Lord. And therefore, such as profess the true religion should not marry with infidels or idolaters. Neither should such as are godly be unequally yoked by marrying with such as are wicked in their life, or maintain damnable heresy, unquote. All right, so that's this 3rd paragraph of the sentence. Now you'll notice a lot of this seems to be boundary material, who you should and who you shouldn't marry. And we'll get to the boundaries next week, but we should be asking, for the sake of this particular sermon, who should be married within the scope of God's purpose for marriage? Okay, who should be? In other words, we could subtitle this as, who is it lawful, who can lawfully marry? All right, we'll go there today. And we're going to extend out from and assume the original example of Genesis 2 as our template. We'll get to boundaries next week, who cannot be legitimately married, but this week we're going to stick with this idea of Genesis 2 as a template and where it goes from here. Now, in order to go down this path, I need to differentiate between marriage as a secular reality and marriage as a Christian reality. Now, let me remind you of what I said last week, that marriage is not fundamentally a Christian institution. It did not start at Pentecost, okay? Marriage is not fundamentally a Christian institution. It was started at the beginning of human history. And so thousands of years before Christ walked the earth, people were marrying and giving in marriage. So marriage has been around from the very beginning of human history, at the beginning of time. It's not fundamentally a Christian institution. We can understand it, better from within a Christian worldview, of course, but that does not imply that those who are not Christians cannot marry. No, the confession says it is lawful for all sorts of people to marry who are able with judgment to give their consent. Only then does it say, yet it is the duty of Christians. Okay, so you'll notice that the confessors start with, marriage is to be a part of the entirety of the human race. All people everywhere on this planet should be marrying and giving in marriage. It's a part of the human reality. That's what we talked about last week. It starts all the way back at the beginning of human history. Because marriage is a creation ordinance, not a Christian ordinance. It's a creation ordinance. It starts at the very beginning of human history. So there are some assumptions here given the societal and cultural world of the confessors. Take yourself back and put yourself in England in the 17th century. And think about what it would have been like to write the original Westminster Confession, and then the Baptists who used it to develop the 1689 Baptist Confession. From paragraph 1 of that chapter, we remember that marriage is to be between a man and a woman, and it is to be a lifelong monogamous relationship. Okay? The confession writers at the first paragraph make it clear it's not to be a polygamous relationship of a man and multiple women. It's to be a man and a woman in a monogamous lifelong relationship. What we'll discover from paragraph 4 is that it's to be between non-related men and women, non-incestuous, if you will. We'll get to that in there. But let me point out something here, that modern issues of marriage were simply beyond the scope of the confession. The issues that we face in regards to marriage today were simply beyond the thinking of the 1689 writers. None of them would have paused and said, well, what happens 500 years from now when a nation decides that two men can be legally married? Never even crossed their mind at that point. But even having said that, though, there were some realities in that day that needed to be addressed that were just as difficult for them as any generation has experienced in terms of dealing with these things. For example, it is likely that the confessors were addressing here the Catholic understanding of sacerdotal celibacy, meaning celibate priests. Remember that the confession is being written in the face of the dominant church of the time in England, being the Anglican Church, which in this case was an offshoot of Catholicism, a broken sense of Catholicism. But Catholicism had a powerful influence over the 17th century in England. If you've ever read the history of England, you know that there's a back and forth between Catholic and Anglican monarchs during that period of time. Catholicism is very much at the core of the Reformation. The church is coming out, I should say the Protestant church is coming out of Catholicism in that day. And Catholicism insisted that its priests must be celibate. That's true even to today. Surprisingly, that's true even to today. And so it is highly likely, that the confessors were here addressing the reality of priests being married, which is why they put the language as they did. It is lawful for all sorts of people to marry. I think they're specifically saying in that sentence that it is lawful for priests of the Catholic Church to marry. And certainly that is the reason why, of course, on the Protestant side, there is no sacerdotal celibacy. The Reformers were virtually unanimous in arguing against celibate priests. Now, I'll come back to the reasons for that in a second, but understand that the extent of marriage in the secular realm, the extent of marriage is simply from the confession that non-Christian marriage is a lawful reality under God. Okay? A man and a woman who can give consent to that, regardless of type, are free to marry. The confessors here are not going to make any specific recommendations as to who should not or who should be married. They will simply leave that up to the conscience of men in that day. Those who are not believers, those who are not Christians, are free to marry. It is a creation mandate. It belongs to the reality of the human race. And so an unbelieving man and an unbelieving woman are free to marry one another if they are able to give consent according to the laws of the land they live in. It's that simple from the perspective of a secular world. Okay, so the extent of marriage in the secular realm is everyone who can give consent and desires to do so, go for it. Okay, but you will notice then the confession then says, yet, okay, it is for Christians something else. It is the duty of Christians, and this is where we want to go with the extent of marriage in the Christian realm. We're going to focus our attention mostly here because, well, most of us in this room, I believe, are followers of Christ, so we should be asking ourselves, okay, when we think of marriage, how do we understand it as followers of Christ? All right, let me reiterate. Marriage belongs in the realm of human history. It is not a Christian institution. It belongs to the realm of humanity. Yet, at the same time, we recognize that there are probably certain wise things to consider in regards to marriage as those who are followers of Christ. Because we assume that all things in creation are being redeemed by Christ, including the institution of marriage. In other words, we're going to see it differently. Just by virtue of our connection to Christ. We're going to understand marriage differently as those who belong to Jesus Christ. And so, it is inescapable for us to spend some time in 1 Corinthians 7. I would be remiss as a preacher if I did not spend some time in 1 Corinthians 7, because 1 Corinthians 7 is an entire chapter written by the Apostle Paul on the subject. And it says a great deal. I'm fascinated, by the way, by the number of Christians that I have counseled over the years who have come to me asking questions about marriage who are absolutely ignorant of 1 Corinthians 7. Very first thing I do is, have you read this chapter? Shall we talk about what Paul says? Okay, if we're going to be those who believe in apostolic authority, let's go to the apostle, see what he says, because he writes an entire chapter on the subject. Now, let me remind you, of course, that 1 Corinthians is a letter written to believers. Okay? It's written to a Christian church. Yes, it is a church loaded with problems. This is a church that has every imaginable problem under the sun. I think God ordained that on purpose and allowed that in order for the apostle to write 4 letters to this church, only 2 of which we now possess, but to write so that we can get serious instruction on a whole raft of things that we as a church will experience, and one of them, of course, being marriage. In the first 6 chapters of this letter, Paul addresses a number of issues that are brought to him by Chloe's people. First chapter, verses 10 and 11. Apparently, Chloe's people had brought him a number of issues that were going on in that church that needed to be addressed. But starting in chapter 7, Paul begins addressing a number of issues that were sent to him in writing. Notice the first verse. Now, concerning the matters about which you wrote. Okay, so apparently the church at Corinth was struggling with a number of issues, and they sent Paul a letter. They sent him a letter full of questions. What about this? What about this? What about this? Okay, so he says, well, let me talk about some of the things that you wrote about. It's interesting to me. It's always been fascinating to me. The first thing Paul chooses off the list of his questions is marriage. Being married. Must have had some significant marriage issues in the church, and so he chooses this as the first thing he wants to talk about. Now, it appears, as you read chapter 7, it appears that the first of these problems is the belief amongst the Corinthian Christians that, quote, sex is bad, unquote. Okay? Seems to be, as you read this chapter, that Paul is, or what the Corinthians are saying to Paul is that sexuality is a bad thing. Now, why would they say that? Well, in verse 1, he rephrases it as, quote, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, unquote. The issue you wrote about, and the issue you wrote about was about sexuality. Okay, so let me address the issue of sexuality right off the bat. Now, I'm guessing here that this is probably a legalistic response by the Corinthian believers to the overwhelming sexual sin rampant in the city of Corinth. Corinth, like many other Roman cities, was a stronghold of pagan religious practices, including temple prostitution, to put it mildly. So there is probably a great deal of sexual sin going on in the city of Corinth, and the believers in Corinth are struggling to understand, how do we as believers deal with all of that out there? And it would appear that the response that they come back with is, well, since all that's going on, it's probably best that we just not have sex at all, right? That's probably what they're saying. And Paul's responding to this. I mean, after all, if something is used sinfully in the world, then Christians must avoid it entirely, right? I mean, if anything's being used in a way that's sinful, then we should just avoid it completely, right? This has been the argument that we've seen generation after generation, particularly in fundamentalist circles, in which it is simply, well, look, this is being used sinfully, so have nothing to do with it, which is basically the argument, by the way, against the prohibition of the use of alcohol. It's always been that basic argument. Well, it's being used sinfully, so we shouldn't use it. Well, I would say, well, the internet's being used sinfully. How many of you are using that? Right? Anything can be used sinfully in this world. Anything can be perverted by reprobate men to be used in a sinful way. And so if the response is only going to be, well, don't ever use that then because it might be used sinfully, then you wind up with a problem. Paul says, no, there's a more nuanced understanding here of what we're talking about. Okay. Now, let me be clear about something here. I realize I have to say this in the 21st century. Paul would not have had to say this in the first century, but we have to say it now. And that is that Paul then, in this discussion of the issue of sexuality, connects it to marriage. Okay? Why? Because Paul recognizes that marriage is the only proper place for sexuality. Now, we have to say that today because that's no longer believed. I quoted you some statistics last week of the number of children that are born out of wedlock, which implies sexuality outside of wedlock. It's almost considered normal in our society, isn't it? I mean, we cheer on and celebrate single moms. Why are we doing that? Because it's become normal in our society. It's become accepted behavior. Now, I realize that there are many single moms that are single for reasons beyond their control. I understand that. I'm not condemning single motherhood per se. But when a society as a whole decides that single motherhood is just as virtuous as married motherhood, you have a problem in your society, right? You have a serious problem in the way that your society is thinking. So Paul connects this issue of sexuality, this issue of it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman, to marriage, because he understands the connection belongs there. And as believers, we would recognize that. Remember, the command against adultery isn't just a command to not have sexual relations with someone that you're not married to while you're married. It is also a command against fornication. Porneia is the Greek word for it. It is the word for relationships of sexuality outside of marriage, period. The unmarried man can commit adultery just as much as the married man can. And we remember also, and this will be clear in Paul's thinking, that sexual intimacy in marriage is the physical reflection of the metaphysical one flesh union. It is a picture of the one flesh union. So sexuality outside of marriage, from Paul's perspective, would have always been considered to be a violation of that understanding of the one flesh union. You cannot practice sexuality outside of a one flesh union because it mirrors the one flesh union. And so Paul and all of the New Testament writers will consider that to be a part of the moral ground upon which marriage is constructed. Why did God give marriage? Because it is the institution by which correct and proper human sexuality is expressed. So those things are essential. Now, again, I have to tell you that because you live in a society that's trying to tell you every day the opposite of that. But we as believers, from a biblical worldview, recognize the order of these things. So Paul here is going to expound a number of principles, 5 of them, in fact, relating to the issue of marriage in this chapter, okay? Now, I'm not going to try to exegete the entire chapter. I'm just going to briefly give you the 5 principles that Paul gives here, okay? So the first is this. Christians, okay, again, this is written to believers, so this is for those of us who are followers of Christ, Christians, choosing a celibate lifestyle in singleness can have an advantage over being married. All right, so Paul starts there. Now, what should be interesting is that the entire purpose of this chapter is this point. Okay? It's interesting that what Paul is arguing throughout the entirety of this chapter, because it's at the beginning and the end of the chapter, is look, it's a good thing to be single. It's a good thing to be single. He speaks of himself as single in verse 7, uses himself as an example of singleness. And then later at the end of the chapter, he sees it as a better thing than marriage itself, all the way down to verse 38. So then he who marries his betrothed does well, and he who refrains from marriage will do even better. That's fascinating to me. Now, Paul is doing this because he recognizes that there will be some who will remain single. Let me suggest the reason why. Not just so that they could focus their entire attention on ministry. That's one reason. I'll get back to that in a second. But there's another. Paul recognizes that believers are going to be in the minority in his day. The church at Corinth wasn't some mega church the size of the city. The church in Corinth would have been small. The number of people in the church would have been limited. And so Paul starts by saying it's okay for you to be single because there's a very good possibility that you won't be able to find another believer who you can marry. Now, in our day, that might not be the case anymore, given the size of the church in the world, but in Paul's day, the reality would be that finding another to marry would be difficult. So he's going to start by saying, listen, if you are a follower of Christ, and you are in a position where you must remain single, that's not a bad thing. It doesn't violate the creation mandate. Okay? It's okay to remain single because unfortunately in the world in which you live now, where you are in the minority, in the severe minority, you may find it difficult to go there. Which is exactly the advice and counsel that I would give to many in the church today who struggle to find someone to marry. We're finding this to become a very difficult situation. Many I've met in the course of my life who would remain single because there simply wasn't someone of the same caliber of Christianity to marry. However, Paul does recognize that singleness affords an opportunity to focus on the work of the Lord, and so he uses that as the way of saying, listen, you might not be able to find someone to marry, but listen, if you can't, that gives you an opportunity. And the opportunity it gives you an opportunity to focus on the work of the Lord. Why? Because you don't have divided interests. Because you don't have to worry, young man, about taking care of the needs of a wife. You can focus your attention on the work that you do in seeking the things of Christ. You can please the Lord with all of your life because you don't have to worry about taking care of a wife. So he affords the idea of a celibate lifestyle in singleness and says that's okay. It doesn't violate the creation mandate. It's a part of the reality of the world in which we live. Which leads to the second principle, and that is this. Christians should marry if they are unable to choose a celibate lifestyle. The fact of the matter is, not all people are going to be able to control their physical appetites, and so it is better for them to marry than it is for them to remain single and to be in a constant temptation to things they ought not to be. Look at verse 8. To the unmarried and to the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion. So Paul's just very practical, I think, in this. Singleness is a good thing. It's not a bad thing. But if you're one of those who simply cannot control your physical appetites, then it is good for you to marry, so that you're not being led into fornication. Okay? So you'll notice that the first two of these principles that Paul brings about in this chapter are really very straightforward. They're very simple. If you don't have to marry because you can't find someone to marry that's of like mind, we'll come back to that in a second, then it's okay for you to remain single and to serve the Lord in your singleness. However, if you're one of those who finds yourself in need of this because of your physical passions, then you should pursue after marriage. Okay. So those are two fairly straightforward principles that he brings, which leads to number 3. And this is the one that the confession writers emphasize. Remember, as I read it a minute ago. Christians, those who are followers of Christ, must only marry those who are believers and are similarly orthodox or of similar beliefs in the Lord. Paul is clear of this only by what I would call peripheral vision. Okay, you have to read chapter 7 and you will see it sprinkled throughout. He doesn't just come right out and say it per se, but you can see it sprinkled throughout the chapter. In other words, Paul sort of assumes it. In verse 39, he tells widows to remarry, but only in the Lord. Okay? But if her husband dies, she is free to be married to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. So he's saying it, I suppose, as clear as he can in that case. He doesn't have a specific principle somewhere that he just states it outright. So he allows widows to remarry, but only in the Lord. In verses 12 to 16, which we'll come back to more in a moment, Paul specifically speaks of mixed marriages in distinction to verses 10 and 11, in which he speaks to husbands and wives separated from one another. The implication of those two things side by side is that Paul is making the argument that a Christian should only marry someone who is of similar belief in the Lord. In verse 16, Paul specifically recognizes that conversion is not something guaranteed in marrying an unbeliever. Verse 16, for how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Those are rhetorical questions, but they have power and punch. And the punch is, you know what? You might fall in love with a reprobate, but there's no guarantee that reprobate's going to become a believer just because you are. In fact, I think Paul in 2 Corinthians 6:14, in which he commands believers not to be unequally yoked to unbelievers, although that verse isn't specifically about marriage, it's about something else. But the principle applies. There's a sense in which when one is married, one is yoked to another. Agreed? Okay. If in fact this is a one flesh union that is taking place between the two of you, if you are not of the same mind, when it comes to matters of faith, what is going to happen in that case? Let me put it like this. When two people come together of mixed religion, okay, an unbeliever and a believer, say a young man wants to marry this girl and he really loves her, but she's not a believer, but he thinks he might be able to sanctify her to become a believer. He might be able to convince her eventually to become a believer, even in spite of Paul's rhetorical question. Remember, the unbelieving spouse puts nothing at risk in the marriage. The believing spouse puts everything at risk. The believing spouse puts everything at risk. He or she is bringing his or her faith into the relationship, and he or her is putting her faith and obedience at risk. The law of entropy says that in the physical world, things go from the more simplistic to the more complex, don't they? They don't work the other way around. It doesn't go from the complex to the simple. It goes from the simple to the complex. The reason why your car rusts is because it's returning to the original items or the original metals and so forth that it was made from. It's not going from the complex to the simple. It's going the other way around. And that is the problem with marrying an unbeliever. I've specifically, there was one time when I was at Calvary, I specifically refused to marry a couple who came where she was a Orthodox Christian and he was a Catholic. I said, Scar, I can't do it. I said, because you, young lady, are putting everything at risk. He's putting nothing at risk. And the fact is that in that particular relationship, the direction is always going to be in his direction. Catholicism insists on it. Those of us who are Catholic know this to be true, right? A Baptist marrying a Catholic, which of those faiths is likely to dominate the relationship? The unbeliever puts nothing at risk. The believer puts their entire faith system at risk. And that's the point that Paul is making here. And this is what the confessors say. Christians must only marry those who are believers. And the confession even goes further and makes a big deal about this throughout the entirety of the paragraph, that they should be similarly orthodox. And it reads, you remember, like this, when it says, and therefore such as profess the true religion should not marry with infidels or idolaters. Neither should such as are godly be unequally yoked by marrying with such as are wicked in their life or maintain damnable heresy. I would argue that it's just as dangerous for a Reformed Baptist to marry a typical evangelical. Because again, which direction is it going to go? Is it going towards the more simple or the other way? The confession writers, I think, here are specifically making the statement, although not directly, to say, if you are a Baptist, don't you dare marry an Anglican or a Catholic. Now, they don't come right out and say it, but I know this. If I were living in the 17th century and someone handed me a copy of this confession in those days, and I read that paragraph, I'd be going, I know exactly what to talk about. So Paul's third point is that Christians must only marry those who are believers and are similarly orthodox. And that may be the very reason, and it is, I've heard already, the very reason why many remain single is because, you know, if you're a Reformed Baptist young lady struggling to keep that Reformed faith, it's hard to find men who fall into that category. So singleness is not such a bad idea in that case. Which leads then to 2 points that must follow from this. And it's an unfortunate reality in human history that marriage has been corrupted as it is. We'll talk more about that next week, Lord willing. But the corruption of marriage, unfortunately, leads us to also having a discussion about the principles regarding divorce that come out of this passage. And Paul also deals with those, and he gives 2 specific principles here. First, Christians, followers of Christ, must not divorce a believing spouse. Or if they do, they must remain unmarried from that point forward. And he's making this point primarily in verses 10 and 11, when he says, to the married I give this charge. Now notice, he says, not I, but the Lord. So he's going after the specific words of Christ here. The wife should not separate from her husband, but if she does, she should remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and the husband should not divorce his wife. All right, so Paul in this case appeals to Christ himself. He says, I'm not bringing this principle. This is a principle of the Lord Jesus himself. If you are a follower of Christ and your husband is a follower of Christ, you must not divorce. That is, or you must remain separated. You must remain, I should say, unmarried for the rest of your life. Now, I'm convinced that Paul is quoting these words directly from the lips of Jesus in Luke 16:18. Everyone who divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery, and he who marries a woman divorced from her husband commits adultery. I think Paul is commenting on Jesus' words. I've often called Paul the greatest commentator on Jesus that ever lived. Here he is commenting specifically and directly upon Christ himself. Divorce is an ugly reality in a fallen world. Some of you have experienced it, unfortunately. It's an ugly reality in this fallen world. And nowhere on this side of the kingdom of God will it be eliminated. But here's the thing. For those who have married in the Lord, our responsibility is to that one flesh union for the rest of our lives. We are responsible because we have made a covenant oath into that relationship. And we are to remain in that relationship because, as Jesus himself says, the one flesh union is a work of God. It's not a work of man. It's a work of God. I said last week that one of the reasons that I enjoy doing weddings is because I get to speak something into existence, right? But make no mistake about the words that I said to you. Even though I have spoken, it is God who has formed the one flesh union between this man and this woman. I don't have the power to create a one flesh union. I have the power to speak the words, but I have the power to create the one flesh union. That's God's work to do. It's a theological reality. It's his work to do. And so if God has done this, then it is something serious to consider. In Mark chapter 10, Jesus says these words in response to the Pharisees who come up in order to test him. And they ask him, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? And he answered them, what did Moses command you? They said, well, Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away. And Jesus turned to them and said, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this command. It was an allowance. It was never intended. Moses wrote it because you're a bunch of hard-hearted guys and you're looking for an out, and so Moses gave you one. But it's not. Jesus goes on to say, therefore, he goes on, because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this command. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Jesus appeals to that Genesis 2 reality. God forms a new creature from a man and a woman to be joined together. He looks at these Pharisees, these teachers of the law, these supposedly pious men, and he says to them, you have listened to Moses who gave you an allowance for something, but you've overlooked the far deeper principle that God himself is the one that establishes marriage in this world and forms men and women into a one flesh union. God created them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. And he's still quoting, by the way. In this case, he's quoting that passage from Genesis 2 that I spoke of last week. So they're no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man separate. Jesus could not be more clear here, could he? There's no getting around what Jesus says here. And for those who say, well, Jesus never touched on issues of homosexuality or transgenderism, baloney. Yes, he did, right there. It is God who created male and female. It is God who formed you with the DNA that you possess and gave you your maleness or your femaleness. It is God who brought you together with your spouse and formed from the two of you a new creation. It's God that did that. Jesus spoke of these things. To say that he didn't is a lie designed to get you to believe something other than the truth. But Jesus puts it clearly here that the one flesh union is a work of God, not man. So before you say, I do, you better be prepared to do all of your life. My wife and I have an agreement. We will never, ever use the word divorce. I just used it. In our conversations with one another, right? Those times when she throws things at me. Yeah. We will never use that word. It will never come up. Because she and I have made a promise to one another that we will remain faithful together, one to another. And the Lord has blessed us with nearly 39 years of marriage. Do we like each other every day? Nope. There's a lot of days she does not like me. See, and I can say that because she's not here. And there's a lot of days I don't like her. More days that she doesn't like me than I don't like her, but, you know. But we are one flesh. And for those of you who've been married long enough, you know what this means, don't you? You know it's much, much more than sexuality. You know that this one flesh union is this knitting together of you and your spouse in the sense that you get to a point where you start finishing one another's thoughts, don't you? My wife and I now have an ability to read each other's minds. She will call me and say, I want to go out for lunch today. And I'll say, oh, I knew that call was coming. And she will say to me, where do you want to go? And I'll give her a restaurant. And she'll say, that's where I was thinking. That's called a one flesh. We, as followers of Christ, recognize, we understand marriage from within a biblical worldview, a Christian worldview, a Christ-spoken worldview, right? In which he himself reiterates the very reality at the core of creation itself, that God created male and female, brought the woman to the man, and they were bonded together into a one flesh union that went on for the rest of their lives. And that's what we're pursuing. And so what I counsel everyone who is married is this. Your responsibility, husband, your responsibility, wife, is to nurture that one flesh union. That's your job. It's not about you anymore. The you has been subsumed into the us. It's about the two of you together now. Now, I realize that may be difficult, but it is what we have been called to do. And a Christian worldview recognizes that at the core. Marry a like-minded person and stay committed to that one flesh union for the rest of your life. There is a fifth principle, however, that must come up in the context of the Corinthian church. I'm not sure how much of this applies to our day. I think it does. It can apply, and it has applied. I've seen it apply in certain people. But this fifth principle is that Christians may be separated and divorced from an unbelieving spouse without fear of adultery. Now, I'm going into this one carefully, okay? I'm treading on tiptoes here, but Paul puts this into this chapter. Starting in verse 12, he says, to the rest I say. Now, notice he says, I, not the Lord. So he doesn't have something in Christ to appeal to, but we don't look at that and say, well, then that's not applicable. No, the apostle has the authority under the inspiration of the Spirit to speak to these matters. Even if he doesn't quote Jesus directly, he's still quoting certain principles that would come from Christ. He says, to the rest I say, I, not the Lord, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever and she consents to live with him, he should not divorce her. Okay, so the principle that I just gave you in principle 4 still applies. Even if your husband or your wife is not a believer, it is still your responsibility as a believing husband or a believing wife to live with and nurture that one flesh union. The principle 4 still applies. If any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever, he consents to live with her, she should not divorce him. Okay, that's fairly clear. For the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. And I think all that Paul is doing here is suggesting that in that unequally yoked relationship, If that happens to be the case, then it is the responsibility of the believing spouse to stay in that relationship in order to sanctify that relationship. You're bringing your Christian faith into that relationship in the hope that God would, from that belief, extend sanctification out to your children and even maybe to your unbelieving spouse. Now, why would Paul include this? Here's why. Again, in this infantile church, it is very reasonable and very possible that two unbelieving people who have married, one of them becomes a believer over the course of time. In this infantile church, where the city is pagan almost completely, two pagan people who marry, perfectly reasonable under the secular reality of marriage. Okay, two people get married, they fall in love, they get married, and now they're husband and wife, and one of them hears the gospel and responds in faith and belief, and that spouse now begins coming to the church, joining with other believers in worship, teaching, instruction. But now that spouse has an unbelieving spouse. The unbelieving spouse refuses to come to the Lord. The Lord doesn't grant mercy and grace to this unbelieving spouse. Now you have an unequally yoked relationship. Now again, going back to the previous principles, we shouldn't create that, all right? We shouldn't yoke together a believer and an unbeliever in the hope that the believer will somehow convert the unbeliever. But there's a possibility that this would happen. It's still possible, I think, even today. So Paul is giving here instructions for this unequal reality that might show up in time. But then he gives these words in verse 15. But if the unbelieving partner separates, let it be so. In such cases, the brother or sister, meaning the believing spouse, is no longer or not enslaved. God has called you to peace. For how do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Paul allows one possibility for I would call it a righteous divorce. And that is, if the unbelieving spouse wishes to walk away from the relationship, if the unbelieving spouse doesn't want to have anything to do anymore with the believing spouse is free at this point. The believing spouse can say to the unbelieving spouse, okay, you want to go? Fine, go. And the believing spouse is free from the relationship. Again, Paul recognizes this reality. If the believing spouse wants out, then the believer is not enslaved. Now, some will translate this to mean free of the individual, but not free to marry again. Okay, some will translate it that way. I don't think that's unreasonable if that's a conclusion that you come to. Some translate this to mean able to obtain a legal divorce without fear of adultery. Again, that would be up to you as the person, as a believer, deciding what to do in this particular situation. Likely what Paul means when he speaks of a life of peace implies not having to worry about reconciliation and being free to enjoy the benefits of marriage again. And I think that's right. Otherwise, why would you bring it up? I mean, what would be the point of bringing it up if you didn't believe that there was some sense in which the believing spouse now can feel at peace, knowing that, yes, I was married to this man, but he was not a believer, and he walked away from the relationship. I kept up my end, but he walked away. In other words, the believing spouse is given the responsibility to remain faithful to the marriage vows herself or himself as the believer, something which would be consistent with that covenant view in Christ. All right? So, 5 principles that Paul gives from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, which leads to this principle. Marriage, as a choice for the believer, is to be understood as a profound institution, not to be entered in lightly, but to be recognized as part of the ultimate good of the Creator. Paul's clearly making marriage an important matter, and it's not to be entered into lightly. It's profound. Making the choice of partner one of diligence. Or I'd say it like this: it's better not to marry than to marry poorly. Better not to marry than to marry poorly, especially as a believer. Now, let me add a caveat to that statement, okay? And I'm beginning to think about this more and more and more as I go through life. There is no perfect partner. There's no perfect partner. And we need to be careful that we do not establish a set of standards too high in the seeking of a partner. And we may, if we do, we may leave ourselves single when it is unnecessary. I saw a meme not too long ago of a woman of asking this question of, I only want a man that does this and has that and looks like this and it's like that. And then the bottom half of the meme, this is 10 years later, where are all the good men? Well, you're not going to find a perfect partner, okay? Now, I'm not suggesting you should lower your standards per se, but I am suggesting that sometimes if you set your standards too high, you price yourself out of the market. So think about that. And that's one of those things that we counsel on a specific basis. So as far as the extent of marriage is concerned, marriage is designed by God for all of society, both inside and outside of the church. Marriage is something that most adults should pursue, since it is the very foundation of human flourishing. Marriage is a good thing, and it has great value, especially for believers. But what is that value? Very briefly, let me talk about the value of marriage. As I said, this was another sermon entirely, so I'm going to make this very brief. We need, again, to think about this from a Christian perspective. Where I go particularly here is to Ephesians chapter 5. You knew I was going to go there eventually. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 to 33 speak clearly to believers. All right, so you take Paul's comments in 1 Corinthians 7 and then you abut them with what he says in Ephesians 5 in relationship to our understanding not only of the extent of marriage and who should marry and why, but what it means to be married. Because the principle that must be kept before us is that marriage, like all other things in the created order, is being redeemed by Christ. And we who are married as believers should be looking to see our marriages redeemed in Christ. We should be looking for that redemption in marriage, just as much as we're looking for that redemption in our soul. It's a part of us, is it not? That woman sitting next to you is a part of you. She is the one flesh union of you. Therefore, we should be looking for this redemption in marriage. Now, if you look at Ephesians chapter 5, there's a familiar purpose to this text. Everybody goes here first, right? There are standards established for how husbands and wives are supposed to relate to one another, right? And so the typical preacher stands and says, now look, women, wives, here's the deal. Be submissive to your husbands. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave us it. All good stuff. And I could spend another hour on that particular subject. But that's, I think, the familiar purpose, but not the greater purpose of this text. The greater purpose of this text is for Paul to speak of marriage as an example of the relationship of Christ with his church. What you are experiencing in your home as husband and wife is a picture of the relationship between Christ and his church. How many of you have thought about that the last time you had an argument? You, as husband and wife, are reflecting the reality of Christ and his church. Paul compares the husband and wife relationship to the Christ-church relationship and uses marriage as an example of this relationship. He uses a number of comparison words like as in 22, 23, 25, 28, 29. And as a body in 23, 28, 29, and 30. The whole thing is built, and this is the point that I want to close with, built on something I want you to think about. Throughout human history, the vast majority of marriages were arranged marriages. In the 21st century, we're kind of like, ew. But you know what? It has worked for century after century after century. Because the vast majority, probably, of the people in Ephesus who were probably married in arranged marriages. And Paul is using that picture to show us the redemption of marriage, in that the church, all of us who are followers of Christ, the church is the bride that the Father went and got for his Son. The bride of Christ was arranged by the Father. The Father went looking for a people, and he clothed them in righteousness, and he brought them to his Son and presented her to him. The self-sacrificial love of Christ, therefore, has created an intimate one-flesh relationship between himself and the church, which is pictured in your home in marriage as believers. That's what you're looking at when you look at your spouse. That's what you should be thinking about when your spouse looks at you, once again, demands something of you that you just don't want to do again. Like, take out the trash or clean this or that or whatever. The fact is that it is a picture, a New Testament picture of marriage, picturing an intimate relationship between Christ and his church, which means that Christian marriage is much more than need fulfillment. This isn't just need fulfillment. We marry because we are connecting ourselves to another in that one flesh relationship, and it is a picture of the relationship we have with Christ. Which is why there can be no opportunity for divorce. Why? Because otherwise we're confessing that it's possible for Christ to divorce us. And we don't believe that, do we? We hope that Christ doesn't look at us and go, there he goes again. Okay, bye-bye. No. See, we have to put our Christian worldview glasses on when we look at marriage and recognize that this one flesh union that we're a part of is a reflection of Christ and his church. That's why Paul says to husbands, love your wife as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her. Are you willing, husbands, to give yourself for your wife fully, completely, absolutely, self-sacrificially? Because guys, it ain't about you anymore. It's about the care and feeding of that one flesh relationship that you have. That's what Christ is doing. That's what Christ is doing with his church, giving himself to that relationship so that it's complete and permanent and perfect and beautiful in every way. Is that what you're doing? We have a tendency to think going into marriage that I can still be myself. I can still like what I like and want what I want, do what I want. But Christ didn't go into the marriage relationship that he had with the people thinking that. That never crossed his mind. He was self-sacrificial, fully and completely giving of himself to it. The value of marriage, then, is in recognizing that it is a picture in our own homes of the relationship that Christ has with us in redemption. And if we truly understand that, if we think about that, if we put that first in our relationship with our spouse, we will truly understand what Christian marriage is. We'll truly understand what it means to be married and what this one flesh union is all about. Although marriage is a universal institution for both believers and unbelievers, for those redeemed and included in the body of Christ, marriage is a sacred and honorable way by which Christ expands his kingdom. redeeming sexuality and parenthood as a part of his larger plan to draw a peculiar people to himself. The extent of marriage is over the whole world, but the extent of marriage in the church is the extension of the kingdom of Christ.